we are Identities, illuminating the relationship between gender variance and non-heterosexuality. And what I would like to do now is to introduce the committee members, and then we'll pass the word to Adina for her presentation, after which I will have each of the committee members sometimes to engage Adina with questions and comments, and then hopefully will be some time for Adina to engage the audience as well. And the last thing I want to say as a way to introduce the event is that this is, as all doctoral dissertations, it's a public event, it's a participatory event. So I invite you to accompany Adina in this very important threshold of her personal and professional trajectory with your mindful presence, with your good wishes, with your energy, so that you also can be with her in this moment. So I want to introduce our external member, is Professor Dr. David Frost. He's Assistant Professor of Population and Family Health at Columbia University in the Mailman School of Public Health. And he was also here in the Bay Area, I didn't know that, Assistant Professor of Sexuality Studies at San Francisco State University. How long ago was that, David?
I'm sorry?
How long ago were you teaching here in San Francisco?
2 years ago.
2 years ago.
I moved out to New York.
Okay.
That's where we met.
Oh, you met here. Great, great. So David's research is concerned with sexuality and health. He has published in outlets that span basic and applied social and health psychology, such as Personality and Social Psychology, and the Journal of Counseling Psychology, and Journal of Social Issues. He currently serves as Associate Editor for Qualitative Psychology and Consulting Editor for Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity, 2 new journals published by the American Psychological Association. And would you like to add anything, David, to the introduction?
No, that was very thank you.
Thank you, David. And also I would like to introduce Professor Charles, who is here at CIS. He needs no introduction, but some of you may not know him. So he's the department chair here in the Issue Psychology department, and he teaches courses on eco-psychology, depth and archetypal psychology and mythology, as well as qualitative research methods and many other things. And he's the author of books such as Terra Psychology, and also editor of, or author, Storied Lives and author, Storied Lives, Discovering and Deepening Personal Myth, and the co-editor of Ecotherapy, Healing with Enriching Mind. Would you like to add anything?
Great, thank you.
Okay, and my name is Jorge Ferrer, and I teach here in the US Psychology department, and I was the chair of Adina's dissertation, and I'm really happy that we're all here in this momentous moment. So, Adina, the stage is yours for your presentation. You know you have about 1 hour, and then there will be time for us to engage in. So whenever you feel ready.
Okay, great. First of all, I just want to thank everybody for coming. I really appreciate everybody being here to support my work today, and especially want to say thank you to my parents for flying in just for the day to be here. And also thank you to my partner Sharina for her support of my work. And for helping me get to this point today, and of course to my committee members for all of your support and mentorship in helping me reach this point. Would it be okay if I sat down for a moment? I'm
Yes.
feeling a little bit.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
Yes.
you guys. I feel a little bit nervous.
Of course, yes. Sitting sometimes helps to ground
Yeah.
myself on earth.
Okay.
So take a breath, do what you need to do, and you know, you feel free to stop at any moment if you need to breathe. This is a supporting environment.
Thank you. I also wanted to just state that this dissertation is dedicated to my dear friend Andrew Ratty, who should have been here today. And you guys heard the title of my dissertation, so we can go ahead and advance it. I wanted to just give you a brief overview of my research questions, and they're the following. How do the 11 study participants experience the world at the intersection of their multiple marginalized queer identities? And what can be learned about their experience through semi-structured interviews, coded and analyzed using grounded theory methodology? The goal of the research is to shed light upon the relationship between having a gender variant identity and a non-heterosexual orientation, And the study purpose is to gain a deeper understanding of the effects of multiple marginalized identities on those individuals who identify as gender variant, as well as non-heterosexual. And just a brief overview of some key concepts and terms so that you guys know what I'm talking about as we move forward. Gender identity, the way that I'm using this term is to mean an orientation towards societal roles and expectations linked to and connected with our biological sex, and consists of both an internal and an external element that is enacted within relationships. Often understood as a binary by mainstream culture between the two opposing poles of masculinity and femininity. Cisgendered, by this I mean an individual whose gender identity, gender expression, and gender presentation match with the societal expectations and gender roles associated with their birth sex. This is a person, in other words, who does not have a variant gender identity. And by gender variance, here I'm meaning individuals who identify outside the traditional binary of male, female, or masculine, feminine as assigned at birth, and instead identify as butch, femme, Nelly, androgynous, transgender, genderqueer, intersex, two-spirit, or some other identification. Marginalized is a term I'm using here to mean an identity category that lies at the margins of a larger social or cultural group. The term implies a group of people who differ from the prototypical member of the group to which they belong and do not see themselves reflected within the group. And queer identities I'm using here to mean individuals who fall under the umbrella category of queer, which includes but is not limited to the following: gay, lesbian, bisexual, questioning, omnisexual, pansexual, butch, femme, Nelly, androgynous, transgender, genderqueer, etc. This list grows and changes depending on who is asked and where. I'm using the term here to refer to anyone who feels that they fall into this category and identifies within the queer community. So just a brief note on pronoun usage. Most participants in my study identified a pronoun of either he or she that they prefer, and I've used these whenever possible. For those participants who did not specify a preferred pronoun, I've used the plural and also gender neutral of they, them, which is a common choice amongst the folks writing on this topic. I've used numbers to identify participants instead of pseudonyms so that the reader would not be influenced by gendered names and potentially make assumptions about the participants' identities. So I know that that's not necessarily like the optimal choice, but it was done here in this situation for a reason. And just to say a few words about the relevance of my study. The academic relevance, this study is meant to contribute to the subjective understanding of the experiences of individuals who exist at the intersection of a gender variant identity and a non-heterosexual orientation, and provide directions for future research. Personally, this research project has special importance to me, and I feel it's important to share with you my personal standpoint as a scholar, particularly in light of the methodological approaches being utilized in the study, which I will come back to in a moment. But I identify as genderqueer, perhaps also androgynous or somewhere outside of the gender binary, maybe third gender. I also identify as queer because if my gender identity is not binary and I am somewhere outside of gender, terms like lesbian, gay, or homosexual don't capture my experience, since they're dependent on my gender identification or the gender identification of the person that I'm potentially with. And I do want to invoke my colleague in the East-West program, Brady's term, me-search here. He coined this term to describe what a lot of us in the department have been doing, which is research on our own experiences. We've chosen the topics that we've chosen because they reflect who we are as people and reflect, what we're interested in doing with our careers and in our lives. And that's true of this choice of topic for me. So this is me search. Thanks, Brady. And social relevance. It is my belief that existing at the intersection of multiple marginalized queer identities offers a unique perspective on our social world that's illuminating and valuable. It's my hope that the application of this understanding will improve conditions for those individuals that inhabit this intersectional space, as well as positively impact our society's conceptions of sexuality and gender as a whole. So just a brief overview on my literature review. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I did look at, under theoretical perspectives, 12 articles and 2 books, and reviewed 7 empirical research studies that included 4 quantitative and 3 qualitative studies. And the theoretical perspectives I've broken into 2 parts. The first part represents the theoretical approaches that informed my choice of subject matter and methodology, and the second part represents theoretical viewpoints applied to issues related to the intersection of non-heterosexuality and variant gender identity. So I'm talking now about just the first part here. Critical theory, postmodernism, and poststructuralism. Each of these perspectives articulate critiques of scientific positivism and are critical of any theoretical assertion that posits an absolute truth. These theories represent the basis of my angle of research, which aims to situate the understanding of gender identity and sexual orientation outside of the mainstream norm and in the direct experience of those individuals whose identity as gender variant and as non-heterosexual. And then feminist epistemology and perspectives on power, Foucault's perspective on power and sexuality, and Butler's perspective on the social construction of gender and sexuality. I've included these to show that individuals who inhabit the identity space at the intersection of gender variance and non-heterosexual orientation have lacked power and access to the mechanisms for self-definition. As a result, the mainstream understandings of these identities are skewed and biased towards definitions that have been formulated from the outside and do not necessarily represent a true perspective on their actual lived experience. It is my belief, based on this literature, that the mainstream, and by that I mean medical, scientific, psychiatric, and psychological understanding of these identities is the result of socially, politically, and historically bound power relationships that constrain and define the categories of sex, gender, and sexuality in our society. So the second part of my theoretical perspectives includes postmodern social theory, contemporary psychology, psychiatry and psychoanalysis, intersectionality theory, and identity theories. And here I've outlined some of the significant theoretical frameworks that researchers have applied specifically to the examination of gender variance and non-heterosexuality and discuss some examples. And these examples include the application of a critical feminist position to Freudian psychoanalytic theories on sex and gender, how the theory of intersectionality might best be suited to explain the experience of individuals with multiple subordinate group identities, and how the concept of identity is understood in the literature. Empirical studies. In general, the quantitative research has a tendency to reflect the positivist, objectivist, and traditional scientific perspective, whereas qualitative research tends to reflect a postmodern emphasis on subjectivity, contextuality, and situatedness. As far as quantitative studies that I examined here, that specifically address the relationship between sexual orientation and gender identity, these tended to link childhood gender atypical behaviors with adult homosexual orientation, or in other cases, sought alternative variables for predicting homosexuality. And the qualitative work that I've examined seemed to be more tentative and exploratory, gathering information in the participants' own words and struggling to make sense of the reported experiences on their own terms. The goals of the qualitative studies tended to have less to do with predicting outcomes, so much as understanding and appreciating complexity. Overall, the literature review indicated the need for more qualitative analysis of the topic area, especially because this research paradigm offers the opportunity for stakeholders to participate more fully in the research process and to speak their experience in their own words. This review also revealed no prior research on the intersection of non-heterosexual orientation and variant gender identity utilizing a grounded theory methodology. So, grounded theory is the methodology that I've chosen. Why grounded theory? Well, Grounded theory emphasizes the experience of the participants. Descriptions of their experience are not divorced from the actual lived context. And grounded theory methodology allows for complexity to emerge and to be taken into consideration in the interpretation. Study design. In-depth interviews utilizing open-ended questions and prompts were conducted with study participants. The interview questions explored the participants' experience of and thinking about their own sexual orientation and gender identity, what they think about sexuality and gender in general, and how they define these categories. Their experience and understanding of the connection between their sexual orientation and gender identity, and whether and how their combination of non-heterosexual orientation and variant gender identity affords them a unique perspective on the world. The design of this study was developed with the hope that both the research participants' internal experiences as well as their interpersonal interactions would come to light around the effect of multiple marginalized queer identities on their lives. The psychological implications as well as the social context and framework in which these develop and play out were areas of interest and were also elicited as data. So just briefly on my study participants. 11 participants were chosen based on their self-identification as both non-heterosexual and as either both male and female or neither male or female. Transsexual individuals who have transitioned fully from one gender to another were not included in the study, and individuals who identified as asexual were also not included. Adult participants at least 21 years old were recruited using snowball sampling and word of mouth. Analysis and interpretation. All study interviews were digitally audio recorded and transcribed. Transcriptions were analyzed using grounded theory methodology, proceeding through several steps, including initial, focused, and axial coding, memo writing, theoretical saturation, sorting, diagramming, and integrating. For the purposes of this study, I incorporated elements from the more traditional grounded theory presented by Corbin and Strauss, and from the constructivist reinterpretation set forth by Harmaz. So the following several slides show just an overview of some demographic information about my participants. And I actually have, hopefully some of you picked up some of the handouts over here. And I know I don't have enough, you can share them. And just refer back to this as I talk about the participants. So if you'll notice, just on this first slide, participant number 1 is my eldest participant. And you guys can just sort of take a look. Participant number 4 is the only originally male-bodied participant. Participant number 5 is the youngest. Participant 9 is the only person of color. And just taking a look at the aggregates at the bottom here. Birth sex, as I mentioned, 1 born a man and 10 women. And in terms of the breakdown for pronouns, 5 identified he, that they preferred as a pronoun, 4 she, and 2 they. And average age, 38 and a half, mean age, 42, range, 24 to 49. And again, 1 person of color, 10 Caucasian. Relationship status, 8 in relationship, 3 single. Average length of the relationship, 6 years. So I'd like to spend a little bit more time on my interview data and the themes that emerged out of my discussion of the data. This section contains several of the primary categories. So gender identifications. Picking labels and terms can be extremely challenging for this population. Several participants identify with the term genderqueer, which they're using as an umbrella category for identities that do not fit neatly within the mainstream gender binary. Other participants have chosen options such as third gender or transgender. The term transgender comes up as either a category they embrace or that they're defining themselves against. And some participants express that they don't have a distinct gender identity at all. And this is an example I'm going to read to you from participant number 5. For a while, I've been identifying as genderqueer, which means a lot of things, I guess. I don't understand binary gender. It doesn't reflect my experience of the world, and I exist somewhere outside of it. I don't like to say I'm in between or something like that, because I don't like that those are the binaries grounding everyone's experience. So that's an example of why some people don't like to say transgender, because for some that indicates that they're moving from one pole to the other, which they're not really like in agreement with. So next category, ideas about gender. Many participants explain gender in relation to biological sex, but we're not in consensus about which words should apply. So male, female, masculine, feminine, or man, woman. Participants were in general agreement that sex is biology and gender is a social role. And this is an example from participant number 10. I think sex is just the biology. I have 2 X chromosomes. I used to have a uterus and ovaries. I have breasts. I don't have a penis. I don't have particularly much body hair. That's sex, right? Whereas gender is a lot more about behavior and sense of self and identity, like how do I behave? Do I sit with my legs apart? Do I sit with my knees crossed? Do I hold doors for people? Do I wait for doors to be held for me? Some participants explain that gender is the interaction between how you move through the world and how other people respond to you, a response loop between how you present yourself and how people are reacting to that presentation. And here's an example from participant 1. I guess what I'd say is like, there's kind of a negotiation that happens around gender where we present ourselves as a certain way and then the world says, yeah, we accept that way, or no, we don't. Then you have to work with it to get it to work out. Participants indicated that gender is often seen as an orientation to the societal understanding of masculinity and femininity. The idea of gender roles is a large part of what we mean when we talk about a person's gender presentation. And this is an example from participant number 8. I don't think roles in society are bad at all. I just think people should get to pick like what and how they want to do it for themselves. So sexual orientation identifications. Identifying their sexual orientation as queer was very common amongst these 11 participants. The term queer is perceived to encompass gay, lesbian, or bisexual, as well as other identities, and is preferred, as mentioned before, because it is not dependent upon the fixed gender identifications of either the participant or their partners. So this is an example from participant number 7. I think queer is more of the bigger term. I'm queer then because my gender is kind of queer. My gender is variant, and if I'm not always a woman all the time, then I'm not always a lesbian, I suppose. Other terms chosen by participants include bisexual, pansexual, lesbian, gay, or often a combination of several terms. And this is participant number 3. I identify as pansexual, which according to Wikipedia is like sexuality that's attracted to people, not specific to gender. It's just an attraction that doesn't associate gender with the attraction. Because I have been in relationships with men and women and transgendered people and people who, like me, are just neither or both. So that's how I identify. I was looking for a term that worked, so bisexual was easy, but it was too polarized, and also, I was not just attracted to men and women. There was this whole panoply in between. So I had been looking specifically for a kind of phrase to use and came across pansexual and looked it up, and it was perfect. So some ideas about sexual orientation in general. Participants agreed that sexual orientation is about attraction and the object of sexual and affectional desire. Because these 11 participants all identify their gender outside of the traditional binary with its poles of masculinity and femininity, and that they all consider themselves to be non-heterosexual, categories of sexual orientation become very gray, with non-specific identity terms such as queer or pansexual becoming preferable. And this is participant number 2. I don't really know what sexual orientation is when it relates to me sometimes, because I'm like a guy attracted to girls, except it's so much more complicated than that. And next category I've highlighted here is the link between sexual orientation and gender identity. Participants reported that shifting identifications along the lines of sexual orientation has an impact on their gender identity, and conversely, shifting identifications along the lines of gender has an impact on their sexual orientation. And this is an example from, actually, I have two examples here. This is participant 1. So prior to transition, I was identified as a lesbian, and I was never really attracted to men as an adult. I was pretty far over on the Kinsey Scale, or whatever, when I started to transition. And then a year into transition, all of a sudden I was very interested in men and men's bodies and attracted to men. I think some of that has been about trying to find a mirror for my own body. Following transition, it was like things are not in line, and my orientation and preference seems to have shifted, and I don't know what to make of that. It's just that things are not lined up, but I'm generally pretty comfortable with it. And this is from participant 5. I've noticed for myself that since I have gotten more comfortable in a strange body and gender, that who I'm attracted to has changed in a way that I wouldn't have expected, which is that I'm more attracted to trans men and trans masculine kind of spectrum, and even cisgender like fags. And I think that has a lot to do with gender and not being defined by who I sleep with. Some participants have attributed this connection to the fact that both their gender identity and their sexual orientation are not fixed, but rather pliable, changing, and constantly fluctuating. Overall, participants express that the connection between sexual orientation and gender identity is too complicated to put into words in a clear, concise, or articulate description. And this is participant 8. I think that the only connection I'm sure I experience is that my soul is in this particular body right now in this life. This is my gender, and this is my sexual practices that end up happening. Next category I want to highlight is a unique perspective. Viewing gender and sexuality from the point of view of the margins is a double-edged sword. It has both benefits and drawbacks for these participants. This is participant 4. When you don't have to think about something, you're somewhat asleep in a way. You're privileged, and with privilege comes great benefits, but it also doesn't come with deep insight. For some participants, the fluidity in the way that they express both their gender identity and their sexual orientation affords them the ability to connect with all different types of people and to see potentialities that they otherwise would not have been aware of. And for some, simply seeing the arbitrary and artificial nature of gender roles is in itself a unique perspective. This is participant 8. I think if anything, it just illuminates social roles and socialization and how funny it all is. And it would just be funny if it wasn't connected to oppression and violence and suffering. But it is, so it's also painful in addition to being really funny. Other participants expressed feeling free from having to follow the rules. From having to follow the roles associated with their assigned gender at birth. And marginalization, invisibility, and passing privilege is my next category here. Several participants shared experiences of marginalization based on their gender identity and or their sexual orientation, both from the mainstream heterosexual and gender normative community, and also from the mainstream lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. For example, one participant, and I'm talking about participant 8 here, expressed that when they dated a cisgender male partner, their queer community was less accepting of them because the relationship less obviously fit into the queer category. And this is participant 8 now. People would look really surprised when they would see me with him. I think some people think of queer as you're always going to date someone of the same gender or something like that. My community is mostly the queer community, and so it seems like people accept me more if I date someone who's female socialized or who's trans, and they can tell they're trans. Some mentioned that when they, as gender variant individuals, make particular partner choices, they are read by others in ways that erases their unique experiences and renders themselves and their relationships virtually invisible. Another participant, and I'm talking about participant 2 here, articulated that he is at times read as straight by other heterosexual people who observe him with his partner, and that this assumption is in effect a denial of a very integral part of his experience. So this is his words. When I think of who my community is, it's queer people, and I feel when I'm assumed to be straight, I feel it's hard for someone to have an actual understanding of what my life has been like without knowing that. I just feel that it's a really significant cultural space I inhabit, and I feel that gets just disappeared or something. It's like straight people thinking that we're the same and our experiences are so similar. But in fact, around sort of these issues at least, our experiences are actually not that similar. I guess I feel it kind of erases a part of me that's there. And the next category I want to highlight is intergenerational differences. So for some participants, it seems that the younger generations have more options, a more accepting society, and more language and terms with which to describe their experience. So this is participant 1. It feels like the language has really changed. In general, it's just attitudes towards trans people have changed somewhat, and it feels like there's more acceptance and more awareness, generally more awareness, and there have been models in the culture. Participants expressed that younger generations tend to have a much more fluid view of gender and sexuality and are more comfortable with terms like queer, genderqueer, transgender, or gender variant. For older generations, however, there were fewer options and there was not a concept of being either in between or outside of the gender binary. That was just not okay. So a few more categories here. Privilege of place, race, culture, and class. So place, race, culture, and class further complicate the intersection of gender identity and sexual orientation. Here's a quote from participant 5. I definitely think that genderqueer worlds are really white. I don't know if it's the origin, but definitely racialized identity. Just understanding how much of a privilege it is to identify outside of the binary, even though it's something that causes a lot of flack, that in most other places it wouldn't be an option. Maybe not personally knowing about it or being afraid for your survival. I think it's a really incredible privilege to have these conversations and to feel mostly safe. And role of religion, spirituality, so harmful versus healing role. Some participants expressed distinctly negative experiences with religious communities that have taught congregants that being non-heterosexual or gender variant is wrong, an abomination, an affront to God, etc. This is participant 10. I hated this message of this non-loving, this angry God, this demanding God, this rejecting God, and so I rejected that. All I could find were these closed-minded, dogmatic, you either believe what we believe or you're out. Plus, there's all this anti-homosexual stuff from a lot of mainstream churches. I was like, I don't want anything to do with that. I don't want to be judgmental. I don't want to be amongst judgmental people. I don't want to be amongst people who would conceive of God as being closed. Several participants expressed having been rejected by their families in direct or indirect connection to their family's religious beliefs. This is an example from participant 1. I do feel like there's the sense in the family that there's been a lot of strife around gender and around religion, and that these things have not been, it's almost like having culture wars in your house. It's so frustrating because after a certain point, dialogue is just not working. Positive religious experiences can be extremely healing, especially for people who have felt rejected by mainstream religious communities. And this is an example from participant 4. I was raised Catholic, and if you're devoted to God, you're devoted to God the Father. It was very hard for me to be devoted to men because I really don't trust them. But to be devoted to God in this Hindu system is to be devoted to a God that is half man and half woman. And that is fantastic because that is often how I feel. So, I'm going to talk about my conclusion and my grounding theory. One of the main findings of this research project is related to how gender identity and sexual orientation are interconnected and interact with each other. If you shift one of these elements, you shift the other. They are interdependent. It is out of this data that the following new understanding of gender identity and sexual orientation emerges. So this is also in those handouts that I've passed around. This is a representation of the Kinsey Scale, developed by Alfred C. Kinsey and his group of researchers, based on their research into sexual behavior patterns amongst both male and females. It's a scale from 0 to 6 that was developed to represent the spectrum of how people might identify their sexual orientation. The Kinsey Scale represented the revolutionary concept that people could be more than simply homosexual or heterosexual. However, there are some inadequacies with this scale. It sets up sexual orientation as a binary, and it does not take into account the extent of potential movement or fluidity of sexual orientation over the lifespan, the folks in transition or questioning, or the ones who have gone all the way through one end and then back around the other side. So consider this example. A traditional heterosexual married couple in which each partner entered the relationship with a gender identity that lined up with the societal expectation for their biological sex. They've been married for several years. And let's imagine that the husband recently came out to his wife as a lifelong cross-dresser and has since gradually begun to dress in more feminine clothing more of the time and come out as a trans woman. Now identifying with feminine pronouns, she expresses that she would like to remain married and is able to embrace a new self-understanding and identity as queer, a male-to-female transgender woman who's attracted to other women. As she begins to transition into a more feminine gender identity and present in a more feminine gender role, her gender shift puts strain on the relationship with her wife. The wife has begun to question whether she can remain in the marriage, even though she loves her husband. The wife insists that she is not attracted to women, identifies as heterosexual, and is unsure if she will be able to maintain a close, intimate relationship with her husband, who is now presenting in an increasingly feminine identity. If the wife were to remain married, she might experience some dissonance between what herself or other people might now view as a homosexual or queer relationship and her own sense of herself as a homosexual woman. The Kinsey Scale does not capture the experience of this couple. Neither the shift that the husband, now trans woman, experiences from heterosexual male to queer female, nor the wife's experience of calling into question her own heterosexuality after learning that her husband has begun to transition towards a feminine gender identity. It is simply not complex enough to take into consideration the ways in which sexual orientation is dependent upon other variables and potentially shifting throughout various life situations. In this example, I just want to be clear that it's not meant to conflate sexual orientation with gender identity, but to show how the two are deeply related. So, if we take the Kinsey Scale spectrum and bend the range into a circle where the ends come around to touch each other, like this, we could more accurately depict the experiences of the fluidity of sexual orientation and would account for some of the complexities in the example that I gave. In this representation, we can still conceptualize the spectrum and the mainstream notion of binary sexual orientation within the circle by labeling the points of heterosexual and homosexual, as I've done here. However, these points are constantly moving targets at best, and as such, are somewhat arbitrary and better understood perhaps as a series of points over time along the trajectory of the circle, like this. You could also picture it as like a smudge along the circle. In this visualization, the mainstream notion of binary sexual orientation is called into question. We can now better account for the directionality of movement around the circle and the possibility of fluidity. So the idea of a spectrum or linear scale, like the Kinsey scale, being applied to gender makes some sense and could be useful to account for those in between genders. The concept of applying the Kinsey-like spectrum to gender identity is not without precedent. This is nothing new. But it fails to take into account the extent of potential fluidity of gender identity over the lifespan, the folks in transition, or the ones who have gone all the way through one end and then back around the other side, as we discussed. So what I've done here is taken this spectrum and bent the range into a circle where the ends come around to touch each other. And with the idea that this would more accurately depict the experiences of the fluidity of gender identity. And again, here, we can still conceptualize the spectrum and the mainstream notion of binary gender within the circle by labeling the points of masculine and feminine. However, like sexual orientation categories, these gender identities are also constantly moving targets and perhaps better understood as a series of points over time along the trajectory of the circle. In this visualization, the mainstream notion of binary gender is being called into question. Here's an example. A biological woman who takes testosterone for a year and then stops, does not get top or bottom surgery, prefers to be referred to as two-spirit, and who does not have a preference for male or female pronouns, occupies a multi-directional area or trajectory on the gender circle. So, taking into account both sexual orientation and gender identity as they interact and complicate each other, which is the primary topic of my research, we might first imagine, as we did above, two spectrums or linear scales which intersect to form a graph. We could plot on this graph, and I'm talking about example 1 here, a point that represents a homosexual woman who leans towards masculine in her gender presentation, but considers herself a woman and a lesbian, and understands the term lesbian as a woman who sleeps with other women. So that's number 1. Number 2, we could also plot a point which is representative of a very masculine gay man who only dates other masculine gay men and identifies as a bear. Number 2. And number 3, we could also plot a point which represents a very masculine-leaning heterosexual woman who dates only straight men. That's example 3. As you can see from these examples, a chart such as this assists with our ability to take into account both a person's gender identity as well as their sexual orientation. However, what this representation cannot and does not take into account are the issues already mentioned: the potential directionality of movement over the lifespan, the folks in transition, or the ones who have gone all the way through one end and then back around the other side. In other words, this graph, while useful in some ways, reifies the binaries of sexual orientation and gender identity. So, what I have done is reach back to the spectrum or linear scales bending into a circle where the ends come around to touch each other. We can modify the graph in the last slide to create, to better account for the complexities already mentioned, thereby representing these identities more precisely and more usefully, and also calling into question the mainstream notion of binary gender and binary sexual orientation. So here you can see the graph that we created above, but is now represented in a more comprehensive fashion by two intersecting circles representing the range of possibilities in gender identity and in sexual orientation. This image can easily be seen as a globe, and is what I'm referring to as the sexuality and gender globe. Just as we were able to plot various identities on the graph, so here also we are able to plot identities, only now with a greater range of options in space within which to visualize where a person might fit. What we end up with when plotting identities on this globe are areas on the surface and within the globe which could represent identity zones. Some of these identity zones are similar by virtue of being adjacent on the globe itself. For example, a homosexual woman with a more masculine-leaning gender identity plots next to a heterosexual man with a more feminine-leaning gender identity, as both display mid-range gender characteristics and are attracted to women. So that would be points A and B. Some identity zones are similar but actually reside on opposite sides of the globe. For example, a person who identifies as neither male nor female, or both male and female, and also as queer, bisexual, pansexual, omnisexual, as in attracted to men and women equally or in similar measure, could be plotted on either side of the globe, points C and D, or even clustered around the center core. It follows also that a person may inhabit several points along the globe over a period of time, and thus, instead of a point, a person's identity or experience could also be represented as a patch on the globe or a line, which could depict movement or change over the lifetime. If we were to bore a hole in the sexuality and gender globe from point C to D, again, this was a person who identifies as neither male nor female, or both male and female, and is also attracted to women and men equally or in similar measure. We would end up with a spoke inside the globe connecting these congruent zones. Taking this a step further, we can imagine that there may be many such spokes connecting similar identity zones on the globe. Another example is a spoke that connects a mostly heterosexual man with a traditionally masculine gender identity to a mostly homosexual woman with a traditionally feminine gender identity. In this case, they inhabit similar zones on the globe in that both are traditionally gendered and interested in sexual and romantic relationships with women. If we added all of these spokes into our visual, we might end up with something that looks like intersecting bicycle wheels. It is important to note that we would not necessarily be limited here to placing points solely on the lines or spokes themselves, but rather they represent relationships between areas on and within the globe. So far I've focused specifically on the intersecting circles of the range of possibilities for sexual orientation and gender identity. However, these two variables never exist in a vacuum, unaffected by other elements such as race, class, culture, religion, nationality, geographic location, and many other factors. Other variables could be accounted for if we imagine that we can add slides or lenses or slices to the sexuality and gender globe. In this fashion, we could tick from one aperture to another on the globe, and each new slide or slice would add a new dimension of perception. It would represent a new variable that might influence the way sexual orientation and gender identity are related to one another. So picture, for example, the variable of class, represented by a range from wealthy on one extreme to impoverished on the other. We can extend the same reasoning as we used above, that the linear scale does not take into account movement or fluidity over the lifespan, the process of transitioning, or those who have gone all the way through one end and then back around the other side, to again justify bending this scale so that the ends touch. And any number of new such circles could be imagined and then added to the globe. So some examples: European American to Native American, representing differing cultural perspectives; Christian to Muslim, representing differing religious perspectives; North America to East Asia, representing differing geographical locations; man to woman, representing differing biological sex classifications; monogamous to polyamorous, representing differing relational styles. It is clear that the sexuality and gender globe will have to be expanded in the future to take into account these other variables that are in relation to and have an impact mutually on one another. The data collected and analyzed in this study point to a relationship between gender identity and sexual orientation, and based on the study data, they are likely part of an interdependent web of mutually and relationally connected variables of identity. So we can imagine that the sexuality and gender globe could evolve into the identity universe, as shown here. So I want to touch on some limitations of this present study and implications for future research. The data and results of analysis cannot be generalized to the entire population of individuals who identify as having a gender variant identity and a non-heterosexual orientation. The results represent the views of a specific group of individuals in a particular place and time, and are not necessarily transferable anywhere else. This study did not include the experiences of transsexual individuals who have fully completed a gender transition and who now identify with the opposite gender from that which they were assigned at birth. It did not include individuals who identify as non-heterosexually oriented, but at the same time remain identified with the gender to which they were assigned at birth. It did not include the experiences of individuals who identify as gender variant but do not identify as non-heterosexual. and it also did not include individuals who identify as asexual. This study was limited to the experiences of adults at least 21 years of age and did not include the experiences of children and adolescents. This study also did not examine the possible ways in which the variable of biological sex is linked with and complicates the relationship between gender identity and sexual orientation. And the study recruitment techniques resulted in an unbalanced sample. As I mentioned already, primarily the interviews were conducted with originally female-bodied individuals who are at various points of either transitioning to male or identifying as genderqueer, somewhere in between genders, and with only one originally male-bodied person. The study sample included primarily Caucasian individuals and only one African-American person. The decision to include all the information collected and not to exclude any data as an outlier or unmatched with the others was made consciously and with the notion in mind that the results of the study are preliminary and exploratory and not meant to be generalized to any population at large. Ultimately, it would be helpful if future research in this area addressed differences between groups of non-heterosexual and gender-variant individuals that differ along the lines of place, race, culture, or class. And finally, some suggestions for future research. To gain a better understanding of terminology used to discuss biological sex versus gender identity and roles and sexual orientation, and how these terms are reflective of and specific to place, time, culture, and class. Explore in more detail the interdependence of sexual orientation and gender identity, and the finding in this study that when one changes, the other also shifts. Explore cultural understandings of the categories and classifications of biological sex and the expectations around these categories. And just some questions for further thought. How does biological sex complicate the relationship between gender identity and sexual orientation? Is there a difference in the understanding of the relationship between sexual orientation and gender identity between those individuals who have not modified their physical bodies and those that have undergone sex change procedures? On that note.
Thank you, Adina, for this very clear and wonderful presentation. And we're going to proceed with the time for engaging with members. And I always invite our panel member to go first. Second member will go after, and I'll go last. So, David, you have like 10-15 minutes even to maybe comment on the merits of the work in your view, and also if there is any critical reflection, especially question you want to ask the candidate about her work. I think that's very apropos. So whenever you are ready, you can proceed.
Sure. First of all, thanks, Adina, for that wonderful presentation. It's always nice to have 180-some page document summarized so nicely. And it's nice to hear it come together so clearly. Congrats also on all the hard work that I know it takes to get to this point. And thinking back to when you first got in touch with me to talk about your work, I remember being really impressed by your willingness to even take on this topic, which a lot of people shy away from because it's so challenging and complex. But as you nicely point out in your introduction, by not doing the work, we risk further marginalizing queer communities. So I was really happy to hear that you were taking on this project. And now, having had a chance to read the finished product, I'm really impressed by the accounts of the lived experience that you have represented in the work. And I know this isn't only because there hasn't been a lot of research on non-heterosexual and gender-varying communities. I think it's really a tribute to the project that you've crafted and your skills as an interviewer that you were able to generate these really deep and nuanced accounts of lived experience in collaboration with your participants. So it was really a pleasure to read, and congrats again on the work. So I just have a few questions today that are kind of in the interest of next steps in the work and conversations that stem from what you've already written, which is fantastic. So glad you reviewed in your presentation those moments when participants number 2 and 8 talked about the tensions associated with passing, and their presentation sometimes as cisgender and heterosexual in their relationships with a partner. And I really love these excerpts because they illustrate the layers of complexity and identity that your grounded theory kind of pulls together so nicely. So the intrapersonal dynamics of negotiating self around gender and sexuality, but also the interpersonal aspects of how identity is grounded in presentation and a relational sense of self grounded in the partner. And also the social reference to other people's reactions to, or even non-reactions to their presentation. So I'm wondering how you might make sense of some of the tensions that participant 8 and participant 2 talked about around how they felt about their identities in those moments. So you do a nice job in the dissertation talking about how at times they felt good about being able to have that heterosexual privilege where people weren't looking at them like they were out of the ordinary, they kind of just blended in, they weren't being discriminated against, but also the tensions of being, I guess in a sense, de-queered. They lost that aspect of themselves in that moment, and at other times felt marginalized from queer communities, having embodied those present those positions of heterosexual privilege. So could you talk a little bit about how your model can account for the way they felt in those moments, both good and bad, as a result of passing in relation to their gender and sexual presentation? Because I think there's a lot of potential for your model to incorporate kind of how people feel about their identities, not just how they identify.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I know that some of these participants mentioned, the process of having to continually out themselves, and feeling that was difficult. It was a difficult decision to make about when to out themselves and when not to. In some cases, I think people are outed anyway, whether they wanted to or not. Or it's just really obvious to other people. And then in some cases, they do have the privilege of passing. But I think as far as how that relates to my model, it's actually not something that I've thought too much about. So I think it's a really good question. But I would say that perhaps it could be that there is a relationship between sort of their identity as once they're outed versus their identity when they're not outed, and that may be another sort of like spoke in the globe, or it could represent sort of either end of their trajectory, their sort of like line or area on the gender globe, on the sexuality and gender globe, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, and you've done a nice job talking about the fluidity of it all, right? That from situation to situation, people present and are perceived differently, right? So their own experience of identity can change from one to the next. I think that's really nicely reflected in your model. The other question I wanted to ask, so I could hear a little bit more from you, was on this notion of depathologizing queer and genderqueer identities. You do a nice job in setting up your project and saying that an aim of the project is to, in fact, depathologize these types of queer identities, and you nicely critique the way the DSM from the American Psychiatric Association has classified a lot of genderqueer and sexual minority identities as sick, quote unquote, right? And I found myself in the discussion wanting to hear you then talk back to the DSM. So based on your findings, what kinds of recommendations might you make now, learning what you have from your participants, to the American Psychiatric Association, now that we're on the verge of a new DSM?
Yeah, I think that's also a good question. I mean, I think primarily sort of what I was getting at with talking about depathologizing these identities is to really try to sort of anchor my research in the voices of the people who inhabit these communities, and not to talk about what these identities are or what they mean from the perspective of somebody that doesn't also belong to the community itself, which I think characterizes a lot of the research that has happened, and you know, a lot of the sort of like statistical type analysis, which the DSM represents, of norms, what, you know, what falls within the norm and what's, you know, a deviation from the norm. It's sort of divorced from people's actual lived experience. And so, you know, that's, I think, having research that's stems out of and is grounded in the communities that we're actually describing would help to, along those lines, to depathologize, you know, these identities that we're deeming as sick. You know, but I'm not really sure what to say to the DSM. I mean, I think in some ways, it's, you know, it's relevant in certain contexts, and then it's not relevant in other contexts. You know, I think that it's kind of a shame in some ways that we have we're dependent on these categories. For example, for people to get access to care. Like,
exactly right.
Yeah. And I don't know what would be sort of like a better solution to that. You know, maybe just sort of questioning like that dependency and trying to figure out like a better way to talk about, you know, what should be the sort of like gatekeeper like thresholds for people to be able to access, you know, medication, hormones, sex change procedures. You know, I don't think that I have like a good answer for that at this point.
No, I think you reflected on that nicely. And again, your model might be really useful here, I think, because you do a nice job of talking about how identities should not be considered symptoms, right? Because someone identifies in a way that doesn't land on male or female and is in between. And it often rejects the being in between because that assumes a binary gender model to begin with. That we move away from this pathologizing of non-male, non-female, to recognizing the whole of the person that sits kind of at the fluid junctures in this globe that you presented. So I hope that your model will get introduced into these discussions around the DSM moving forward, because it can certainly be useful.
Absolutely.
But I'll take a step back now. Thank you again for having me as part of this conversation. I appreciate reading the work and being able to engage with you while you were working on it.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll have a chance to talk more after.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for your questions. And we'll move now to Craig, and then me, and then maybe still some time after we go. David, you want to intervene again after we close? So,
Well, Adina, there's so much that I appreciate about your research and the process that went into it that I could be here all day just talking about it. So I've only picked a couple of things, you know. One is that, you know, as my training is in social science, among other things, and I've had to deal with scales and linear measurements a lot. You've managed to kill the remainder of any interest I might have had in those things. So, the way that, you know, all the way from the beginning, you were very respectful and brought such integrity to preserving the voices of your participants as you actually heard them. That was just lovely. I just appreciate that. All research should do that. Yours was just exemplary that way. I wish all research did do that, actually. The questions themselves were so rich, and in terms of some of the categories, the social constructs that we use when we talk about these things, I appreciate how you have, I mean, the approach sometimes is to try to shatter them or break them down or whatever, but I see yours more as fictionalizing them or softening them in a way, and it was just lovely. That really worked for me as a reader of your work. And when I was watching your model evolve too, which I love the model, and the Jungian still poking around somewhere inside me kept thinking of mandalas, you know. And so the one that you came up with in the end just was, well, the Jungian ones that I've seen basically are two-dimensional diagrams that Jung thought represented psychic wholeness. Yours is three-dimensional, so and it just has such great depth to it. I just love watching it. So I want to actually start with a question about your model. We've talked about this a little bit in terms of, and you mentioned it today too, in terms of making it move. What plans do you have for that? Because it seems like it just wants to move, you know?
Yeah, I think, well, someone suggested to me to actually create like a website that's like,
yes,
you know, where you could sort of like zoom in or out onto the globe or into it even, and, you know, make sort of like different, like I'm considering them kind of like biomes, like different like environmental regions or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, and yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think there's endless possibilities there. You know, I don't know what it would entail to design something like that and like a program that would actually allow you to do that. But I would love that. I mean, I think it would be really cool to, and even as a way of sort of collecting data and testing the like applicability of this model, you know, with a huge population of people, to have people be able to put in their identity parameters and like map themselves there, see what we end up with.
Yeah.
It's visualizing an hologram, you know.
Yeah.
An hologram in which everybody could see really like, you know, anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it itself would be a focus of the collection if you wanted it to, of stories about this and how people make it theirs. Lovely. When you go through work like this, you inevitably, it's always it's rewarding to watch people tentatively, it's usually tentative at first, step into the fact that you're now a mentor on this topic. And so what would you, I want you to speculate a little bit, what would you, as a mentor, say to other people doing future research on this? What would you suggest to support them in their work?
It's a good question. I guess is just try to remain open-minded. You know, I think there were a lot of things that came out of the research that I didn't expect, and not so much that like were sort of contradictory to my expectation, but just beyond what I ever imagined possible to come out of the questions that I was asking. So yeah, just remaining like open to that, to whatever it is that's actually emerging, to be able to see that and, you know, follow the thread of that. Yeah, I think that's the main thing.
Great. And I wanted to ask you, what most surprised you about the research?
Do you mean like topic-wise, or like? Just
in terms of, it's more at the somatic or emotional side of, oh, wow, or, you know, I didn't expect this to go in that direction, you know, those sorts of.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was one thing that comes to mind which is interesting, which is that in the early days, I did include some questions around spirituality and religion that then got taken out of my interview, which actually ended up emerging just organically out of the data. So I thought that was really interesting, and that was surprising because it wasn't an aim. It felt like a little bit of a like sidebar, but it did end up coming out anyway. And then I think people's gratitude, that participants' gratitude that this research was being done, and that people were interested in their stories, and that what they had to say and their experiences actually mattered to somebody. You know, that was really special to me.
Thank you.
Well, what a journey, eh? So again, congratulations for the presentation and for the work. I echo David's and Craig's. You know, like the work is impressive, it's clear, and it really contributes, advances, you know, knowledge. So that's all totally clear. For me, like as you know, I teach theoretical research here at CIS, not qualitative. So for me, I was quite delighted and impressed about the rich use of theoretical frameworks in your work and theoretical standpoints, informing research, justifying research, guiding the questions, and then interpreting the questions. So that was, for me, it's a merit of the work. It's like it's really a great model, a great exemplar also of how theoretical research and qualitative research can be really skillfully and combined in a powerful synergistic way. So I think that's really great, and I'm going to be using your work as an example of this in my classes. And then also, of course, the sexuality and gender globe model. I think it's an advancement in the field, and I think David has more knowledge about this than us, but I believe that it really honors the fluidity of gender identity and the complexity of the relationship of gender identity and sexual orientation in ways that I haven't seen myself other models do. So I really hope you really get this into publication soon. If for someone else, that's it. And also I was happy that David also highlighted your interactional model of sexual identity that you didn't cover in the presentation that much or at all, and I was surprised because I really think it's very valuable, to see that the model of sexual identity is not just based on my own self-sense or self-presentation, but also in interaction with others. It really honors the entire intersubjective turn in psychology and psychoanalysis and developmental psychology and needs work. So I think that was really well done and very important. So I have some questions. I think I have two main questions, and then if there is time, I think maybe more. Let's see. My first question is like more also you are both. It's more methodological. It's a reflection. You are both an insider and outsider in this world, right? You are part of this community of people you are researching. At the same time, you are a researcher. That involves you, implies you, it forces you to take some critical distance from the data. So, and I would like you to share with us what are the merits and challenges that you may have experienced of this being in this position of being able to dance between inside and outside positions. And I was going to relate that with a secondary question that Craig stole from me.
Well, DSM was stolen from
exactly,
me.
So that's great. That's great. And it was like, the concept of grounded theory, grounded theory as researchers, to set aside any preconceived notions about what they're going to find. But as you are an insider of this community, that may be more challenging, So I was going to ask you to, what do you find anything that went against your expectations? Do you find anything that went against your preconceived notions, anything that surprises you, But in general, if you want to speak more about the merits or challenges for you of this being part inside and outside the community that you're researching.
Yeah, I mean, I think being an insider in the community in some ways allows me more access to the population, the group of people that actually agreed to be in the study. And I think also an understanding of some of the terminology that people are using that it didn't need to be explained to me, So yeah, I mean, maybe in a sense it's impossible to totally set aside that identity, right? Because of that, there are certain things that maybe did go unspoken since, I mean, I understand, I think, what people mean by genderqueer in a way that somebody else wouldn't necessarily understand. But I did what I did my best to set aside that insider perspective and to, try to look at it objectively as well. I mean, I think especially in the process of coding and allowing the categories to emerge out of the data itself, not to impose what I wanted to find onto the data. It's a dance, it's a tension between those two elements. And I guess, I'm definitely coming from a postmodern feminist framework in that sense. I don't think that there is a totally objective standpoint on the data to come from. So, again, I would just reiterate, it's probably impossible for me to set that totally aside.
Yes.
But it's, it's a dance, it's a tension that we play with, I guess, as researchers.
Yes. I think you are a good dancer. In the way, judging from the product, I was just, just curious about your particular areas, I mean, the merits of theater and the challenges, so thanks for that. And then my next question refers to your model. And is it easy to bring it into the figure 6, the sexuality and gender gap? Is it easy to bring it into the PowerPoint? I think previous one. That's great. That's great. So obviously, I mean, here your model goes, I think, a long way, to construct the binary position, to bring fluidity, very well needed fluidity to these categories, Again, I think in ways that many other models don't. So I'm very fond of the model. I'm very happy that you came up with it and see the evolution, the graphic evolution. It's very cognitively rewarding. It's like, okay, you really can see the development of your thinking and the development of our thinking as a culture, as for you too, and to feel all this, And then, but when I look at the model, I still see the binary there, right? We still have the terms, the masculine and the feminine. We still have sexuality and homosexuality. So in a way, a critic, could say that the model, even though it's constructing the binary opposition, is still kind of subtle ways refining it or perpetuating it because it still maintains that. And I love Craig's comment. In a way, Craig's helped me with my question because Craig's mentioned about how you were fictionizing and softening the categories without getting rid of them, and that was like, okay, that helps already a lot. But I'm wondering how could you respond to that criticism, and also what's the alternative? I mean, it's inventing a whole new language, and how that work here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I was trying to show with the previous circular scales, but I would just say that, and maybe I should have added it to this image, but, so with the whatever this side is, homo or hetero, that this is really more like this, so that it's not like a point. I'm not, this whole thing could be considered that, and maybe even narrowing down like this, so that it's not, I think this reifies the binary in a sense that it's as if this is a point here, but what I'm suggesting is more like, an area, I guess.
Yes. No, I totally understand that. And still, I mean, for understandable reasons, I'm not saying that should be different, I don't know how it would be different, but the terms are still there in positive source, so even visually there is the sense that binary still is in the model. How would be a model to think about these issues without these categories? I mean, I don't have an answer, and I think probably anyone has, but I'm just...
It's a good question, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that the way that I'm trying to think about it is an evolution, right? This is, to me, the next evolution. Maybe the next step after is to do something else, get rid of those labels and call it something else, I don't know.
Yes. That helps. That helps, thanks. My last question would be, it's kind of different in a way, it's tangential to your work, but I'm kind of personally curious to know your opinion after having done this research, As you know, gender queers, historically across traditions, they have had in many traditions, like in Hindu traditions and indigenous traditions, a particular sacred role, in many peoples, about being mediators precisely because they're kind of conditions that we're calling in between or different terms, semitic terms for those, and you were not, your net, your fisher net wasn't really going for those kind of questions, but it's particularly striking how, in our society, queer genders, they don't have that particular role, at least that we can perceive socially. So I'm wondering in your research, is there something that anything your research can illuminate on that, that difference, between the traditional historical role of those and then what's going on in our culture?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that, there are some, and, I reviewed some of these articles in my literature review with some people who are writing about using, for example, a Jungian perspective to talk about anima and animus and like, you know, the third, the self as the like unity of these two elements. I think there's some hints of like ways that we can think about it in our society to kind of like make some meaning around it. I get the sense overall that we're just sort of lacking, you know, like a creation myth around this, or like, you know, some kind of meaning system that situates gender queerness within it.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think there are potential ways to think about that that could be developed further.
Yes. Let me articulate this because I'm very curious of your opinion on this. Do you feel, based on your experience and in your research and all in your community, that queer gender individuals are they have like some kind of like special, potentially special spiritual or sacred access or role that can play for society as it has thought traditionally in so many people?
Totally. That was what my category of like a unique perspective on the world was meant to get at, which is that I think that these are people who have a unique perspective on what sex and gender is in general, and a way of thinking about it that other people don't have. For someone who's you know, gender identity matches with the expectations for their biological sex, and their sexual orientation is sort of, you know, matching with that according to the societal role. These are people who don't, you know, have to think about that. They don't question it. Everything just feels normal. That's the way it is. Whereas for someone who's gender queer, everything about their gender roles, their sexual orientation, and the expectations around their biological sex get called into question. And, you know, so this community has done a much more like in-depth analysis just to like personally make sense of their own lives than most people on it. So yeah, I think that's definitely the role as I see it. You know, I think it's in a similar way to, you know, communities of color and paying attention to what they have to say about race in America, you know, that people who, you know, have privilege in, you know, white privilege or privilege in the area of race, you know, don't have a sophisticated analysis of what race means. You know, you can extend that same logic.
Yes, that's right. That's great. Kind of initiation to your special approach. That's great. Very quick last question for you. Like, I mean, I think that the three committee members agree that this research is very important and needs to be disseminated. So I'm wondering, what are your plans for dissemination of your work in terms of, have you targeted already some journals that may be interested in a summary of your findings, conferences, presentations that you are planning to disseminate your work and so forth?
I don't have any clear idea of like particular journals. You know, I've been really focused on finishing the dissertation. You know, but as a next step, yeah, I definitely would like to get it published and out there. You know, I'd love it if, you know, if you had any suggestions for me on places to look or places to submit my work. But yes, you know, it is my hope to publish it. You know, I think, of course, in particular, the visual model at the end.
Then there's a British journal called Sexuality that may be interested, but I believe that David may be much more informed than us about this matter. What do you think, David? Is there particular journals that they may be interested in publishing this work?
Certainly. There's a newish journal that's also, I think, based in the UK, Psychology and Sexuality. That would be, I'm sure, interested in the model. And also the new journal that's coming out, Psychology as Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity. I don't think they're accepting submissions just yet, but I'm sure they'll be very soon. So once I hear that that is open, I'll forward anything to you.
Great.
But those are two options. Off the top of my head, certainly would be interested in the work.
That's great. That's great. Thanks so much. Is there anything else, David, you'd like to comment or say before we, three of us, I'll ask the same, Craig, the three of us leave the room and just talk briefly before coming back to give our final verdict?
Not now, but I'm sure, hopefully we'll have a chance to talk more, Adina, later on, and I'm happy to talk with you as you consider venues for publication, etc.
Great, thank you.
And you, Craig, is there anything else?
Great. Thank you.
Great. So, David, we're going to leave Adina with the audience so that they can also engage her with some questions or comments they may have. And we're going to disconnect the conference call, and then we're going to go outside and call you on a cell phone.
Okay.
So we can just talk briefly before we come back here.
Great.
Okay.
We don't talk about things like race, class, ethnicity, sexuality, gender within this department as much as, say, maybe other departments in CIS too.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I actually found a lot of support for my work. You know, I had a different topic originally. Let me back up. I think that this is a larger question because, you know, I came into this program thinking that I would learn a lot of content about psychology and spirituality, and I thought that that's what my dissertation would be about. And, you know, I think what I actually experienced was a very transformative program that helped me find my own voice as a scholar, and that reconnected me with myself and what I was doing before I entered the program, which I find really interesting. It's not what I expected. And I have a background in social work, and I've taken a lot of courses in you know, LGBT studies, and you know, I was a women's studies major as an undergrad. So this is where I came from. These are my roots. This has always been you know, my research, right? Like what I'm mainly interested in. And I think on that point, I found a lot of just really strong support from the faculty in our program to follow the thread of my own interests and to develop, you know, my own sense of myself as an expertise, you know, an expert in this area. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that directly answers the question. I think that, you know, it would be great to include more diversity and diverse perspectives in East-West curriculum in general. I think that's, you know, a separate issue, and I would love to see that happen. I think there's potential for a lot of like crossover and collaboration with other departments that doesn't always happen, and that would be great to see as well.
You should propose a course.
I mean, yeah, it's a good idea.
And a high-paid job.
Thank you. Since the day that I met you, you have such a clarity of thought, and the presentation was just wonderful. I mean, it was just wonderful. It's really special to be here. I know I have a lot to learn on gender issues, on race issues, and I keep getting lessons. So for me, I'm coming from the position of asking and not really knowing. But you mentioned a couple of times something that sounded like the recreation of constructs of privilege within the community itself. So there's an insider-outsider kind of thing that happens within the community, but you didn't. It's not really a part of your research. I'm wondering if maybe you could speak about that, the tendency of humans to kind of recreate these structures, even if they see themselves over and against outside structures. If that was happening.
It's a good question. I mean, I think it's like one of those like fundamental issues that keeps on coming up in like sociologically, you know, like the us versus them thing, insider outsider. So I don't know that I have an answer for that per se, but you know, I think it is even within minority groups that tends to get reconstructed. So yeah, I mean, even within the like LGBT community, there's like people who are marginalized.
Yeah. find that really fascinating, that we tend to just recreate the human mishigas wherever it is that we go.
Hello?
Hi, David?
Yes.
Okay, so you're back into the room. So, well, we have quickly discussed your work. We all of the three of us have quite a lot of time to examine your works, and I think the three of us are very impressed with the work, and very, we're going, of course, to pass the work. There's some minor revisions that you'll do after the defense. There's in some of David's points and a few other minor things, but we're very happy to pass this very impressive work as an original contribution to the field, and to congratulate you, Dr. Adina Morguelan.
Appreciate all your support.
Congratulations, Doctor.
Wonderful.
David, do you want to say anything else? Congratulations.
Thank you so much, David. I just really appreciate all your support and help and feedback.
Of course, and I'm back in the Bay Area pretty frequently, so I'll send you an email next time I'm coming through, and maybe grab coffee and talk about location stuff whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great.
I would love that.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Great. So, David, thanks for being so
You just need to do it. I'm ready to do it. I'm sure you do. But I may not even know.